running?
Yep.
Okay, well, hello and welcome. Thank you for coming. I know this is a very busy time of the year for everybody with markings and so on, but I'm very grateful for you coming along. And I want to talk a little bit about a project I was involved in, which actually finished a couple of years ago, but I've taken it off the shelf and dusted it down again because recently I was invited to Beijing to a meeting of European Ministers of Education with the Ministry of Education of China. And they were talking about higher education cooperation, how can we make it work, what are the current challenges. And I was invited to go and give a presentation there. And so I just revisited a project we'd done a few years ago and updated some ideas and some thoughts. And what I want to do is to look at how briefly higher education has changed in the last 30 to 40 years, some of the major trends, and to look at how individual universities and individual staff have actually responded to these changes in a variety of ways. And then to sort of pick up on some points that occurred to me mainly through my work in administration as an HOD. I was HOD for 6 years, and I came across a number of tensions, and I have some thoughts on opportunities that we have. I don't want to be too despairing about, oh, everything's going terribly wrong, and how bad higher education is as a place to work. I don't want to dwell on that. I want to look at opportunities that we have. So reorientations is the word we're using for how the ideology in higher education and how our practices have changed. Compliance, defiance and appropriation are three of the major ways in which people and institutions respond to the shifting change in ideology and practice. Okay. So the project we did was a project I did with John Nixon from Liverpool Hope University and Feng Su, who was also from that university. We looked at UK, and then we extended the project and invited contributions from people in Australia, the US, and so on. And so what we were doing, we were basically following these four questions, looking at the current policies in higher education and what had shaped them, and what actually happens at the system level, the national level or the regional level, and also the institution individual level, so looking down, and looking at ways that they could be understood and interpreted. By the time we finished, we covered all these areas. Small states, we had Professor Mark Bray from Hong Kong U involved. We had contributions from all these places. So it was quite a broad spread. I didn't get anybody from South America, unfortunately. That would have been very helpful, but other than that, we were quite reasonably well spread. Hello, Gaffer. Now, we located our research and the subsequent publication of it within the area of comparative ed. And the book we published was the Comparative Education Research Centre series on comparative education, published both by Cirque and Springer. And we would justify it by using the notion of juxtaposition, which just means putting one thing next to another thing. So if you don't mind, Nancy, if I just take your phone, and if I just take your phone, Cherry. I mean, we can say this is a mobile phone, but when we put it next to another, we can see more clearly the specific characteristics of this phone. For example, the colour, the size, the design, the location of the different buttons becomes more apparent by the fact of putting them together. And this, I think, is the strength of comparative approaches, comparative education, is that you can see more by looking at two things than you can by looking at one thing on its own. also, by digging a little bit deeper, we might be able to explain why is one phone bigger than the other phone? You know? How do we explain the price? And we can look at the cultural context, for example. And the other thing that's related to this is you might be familiar with Ferenc Marton's work on variation theory. And his theory says basically we learn by perceiving what is different about a new object of learning. Okay? So if I'm learning something, say, on management skills, I will learn something new by seeing what is new about the new thing, what is different. And this act of perceiving variation is a very strong tool for learning. Okay, and then the idea of juxtaposition comes in again. By seeing difference clearly, we can learn new things. And the other thing to bear in mind from comparative education, a point that Mark Mason makes quite clear in our book on comparative education research methods, is that we shouldn't compare for no apparent reason. We should have a good reason for comparing, and to do that, the two elements should have at least something in common. I mean, I could go like this and say, well, let's compare the mobile phone with the plastic bottle. Well, you might think, well, okay, the only thing in common, they're meant to be held, so we could look at the portability issues, but really there's not sufficient in common for this to be a really meaningful comparison. So comparative education only works if we are comparing things which can be compared in a useful way. So that was our rationale behind what we were doing, and it shaped a little bit how we approached the study. This is our conceptual framework, our map of what we were looking at. We wanted to look particularly at the white boxes in the middle. We were looking at the attitudes and motivations of the different stakeholders underpinning the changes that we were looking at. We wanted to look at how policy was formulated and what kind of policy was formulated. And we looked at specific areas of policy such as mission and vision, finance, approaches to internationalization, changes to the curriculum, innovations in teaching and learning, and so on. These were different characteristics which emerged from our study of the new trends in higher education. And as we did our interviews and our more detailed reflections, we perceived all these factors in the yellow boxes that were obviously shaping higher education. Things like politics, changes in government and ideologies of government, technology, education, changes in the way we think about education, socioeconomic factors, geography, where you're located was a key influence on the kind of way you did higher education, and history, force of history. It's actually a three-dimensional weight of history. Sometimes historical inertia is a powerful force in shaping what we do. And we also discern local and international, or even global, national, regional, and local forces. So the idea of multiple levels of context. And we looked here at how this operated at the system level, and then we went down to the individual level, with the institutional level in the middle. So we looked at all these things as a system-based phenomenon, then as an institute phenomenon, then how individuals reacted within this framework. So that's our conceptual framework or mapping. And we were particularly attracted by the notion, I won't say we were attracted by the ideas, but we were attracted by the notion that a major force for changing higher education was the ideology of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism emerged after the Second World War and became particularly associated with Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And it was seen as a way of stimulating the economy, which had become a little bit stagnant and not very dynamic. So the idea was that we should see the whole world as a market, and we get rid of barriers, and so we encourage trading on an international dimension by breaking down all the regulations that were a hindrance to trade. And one of the new areas of commerce is education. Seeing education not as a public good, something which is there for the benefit of citizens, but to see it as an economic good that could be bought and sold, marketed. And so the notion that education needs to be entrepreneurial in its approach. And this would help the economic competitiveness of nations by making education part of the economy. Another aspect was privatization. The privatization of the provision of education and all the things which I will talk about later. The use of corporate processes taken from business management applied to education, whether they fit or not. And the notion that education, therefore, must be value for money. I am a paying customer. I am not a student. I'm a paying customer. Therefore, I demand value for money. Why have you not given me a grade A? I've paid a lot of money for this course. It is your job as my teacher to give me an A. That kind of mentality. Okay? And also very much a utilitarian view. Now, I'll return to this in a moment. So, here are the causes, the economic difficulties I mentioned. The fact that public money became tighter, particularly when there's a big demand to expand higher education. That's very expensive, particularly when there are other demands on the government's purse. So that creates a space for partnership with private providers. Also, the second half of the 20th century, we saw lots of geopolitical changes. We saw the rise of China, for example. We saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. We saw the development of regional blocs, the European Union, for example. And so there were lots of new alignments which were happening. And also the forces of globalization. Greater ability to move, mobility, the transportation, cheap transportation to take us around the world. IT, email. When I was young, if I wanted to invite you, I had to write a letter and wait for that to be delivered and wait for a letter to come back. And I remember in the 1980s, the invention of fax machines, and what a great time saver fax machines were. Now, of course, you just send an email, and the speed of communication is so rapid. And that's had a major effect on how we can do higher education. International delivery of courses, for example. Now, this is quite a complex diagram. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's actually trying to trace the journey of the changes. Up here, the traditional higher education around the 1950s was kind of an agreement between the national government, the state, domestic students, and the higher education providers. State provided the money, higher education provided the courses, domestic students went to university, and that helped to contribute to society. But then all that kind of relationship became destabilized because of the things I was talking about: stagflation, globalization, the need to expand higher education, and so on. And it created a new kind of relationship. One where it's no longer just the state, but we're talking about global ideas, regional, national, local, and these ideas are often in tension. So it's not a stable environment anymore, it's a very unstable environment, higher education. We're not talking about domestic students, we're talking about international consumers. So the shift from student to consumer, the shift from domestic to increasingly international. And then higher education courses, instead of being often broad, liberal arts, science, knowledge for the sake of knowledge, the idea of the educated person, instead we have higher education chasing the market. The market forces now determining what we teach, what kind of staff we employ, and so on. And now, so we have new relationships, new ideas as to what a university is. We have new ideas as to how we govern a university. I was very interested to note recently that the highest paid member of staff at the University of Oxford is not the Vice-Chancellor. It's the lady who looks after the share portfolio of Oxford University. She is paid £500,000 a year to look after the university's portfolio, investment portfolio, which is well over £100,000 more than the Vice-Chancellor earns. So there's this shift now to privileging and high status for those who are related to the money aspects. Different, well, maybe not different, but ideas as to what quality is and how we measure quality. The whole notion of performativity coming in to higher education, that now we're focused and measured on our outputs, our productivity, just like a factory worker will be measured according to the productivity. Then we have new courses and new ways of delivering courses with IT, MOOCs, and OOCs, and all these kind of things. We have Moodle and Blackboard and touch screen, smart boards, and a big change in student expectations and student experiences. Young people today are very different to young people when I was a student. We went to university to have a life experience, to learn something, to meet new people, and to, in our case, drink some beer. That was why we went to university. Nowadays, and I'm generalising here, people tend to be much more focused on what they can get out of the university for their life chances, how this will impact on their job, for example. So, as a result of all these, we find a number of manifestations, partnerships, international partnerships being one feature, regional partnerships. Curriculum that has got both local and international components. I've got a project now with John Lee, which is how globalised is the Education University of Hong Kong in terms of the courses we offer? Are we really catering for globalisation? Because if we are not, how can we attract international students? Market-driven courses, a diverse student body, IT-enhanced pedagogies, learner-centeredness, and also private and privatised public universities. So those are kind of phenomena that we've seen manifested. But then, what we were interested in, well, to what extent do we actually buy into these? To what extent do we actually accept these as academics, as institutions, and as systems? These are the global trends. So do we comply, or do we defy? Do we just accept it? Okay, this is the way life is, we have to accept it. Or do we respond in other ways, and why? Okay. Hello, Catherine. I'm enjoying it. You haven't missed much, though. Okay, so these are some of the impacts I mentioned. Specifically, English as the medium of instruction being one of the major trends of recent changes, and we've seen that here within our own university. The shift from Cantonese as a medium of instruction for the majority of our courses to now 80% are expected to be delivered through English. But we should also note that it's not just English. We can see the rise of other strong regional and international languages, and Chinese is obviously making a play to become a strong regional and international language through the Confucius Institutes. We've seen corporate branding and marketing, courses which are determined as viable only on economic terms. We have to do a business plan now when we think of a course. We have to do a business plan to show that the consumers will buy it, and we have to describe how we are going to market the course and advertise it. We see the rise of managerialism, the manager. Who has the best officers? A block. What do we find in A block? Human resources, finance, registry. Okay, it's not the philosophers. You know, it's not the academics who have the very nice officers, it's the managers now. And all the things that I mentioned earlier, quality assurance and academics as the entrepreneur, and so on. Alright, so that's a basic summary of the impacts that we've seen. Here's a very nice example, those of you who were here about 5 years ago. This was the shuttle bus going to University Station. And this is powering education. Apparently, I don't know if this is true, we paid 1 million Hong Kong dollars to a company to come up with powering education. Okay. I wish they would pay me that kind of money for simple ideas. But you can see here some of the aspects. You can see the marketing going on, globalization, regional power, child-centeredness. But actually this child is made up of tiny photographs of academic staff. The size of the photo depends on their status. Some of the bigger photos are the chair professors and the vice presidents. The tiny photos are the assistant professors. Okay, I'm somewhere around the ear, in there somewhere. But that again I thought was an interesting way of portraying yourself as a university, whereas Hong Kong IED was in those days. So corporate marketing, the message becomes very strong. So based on my experiences and our own study around the countries I mentioned, we found a number of tensions. One in Australia in particular is the search for innovation. Now one university decided, eventually they rejected the idea, but they considered strongly changing the name of the School of Education to the School of Learning Innovation. But the problem with that is innovation necessarily a good thing? And what do we mean by educational innovation? It might be something I've never done before. Maybe I start using PowerPoint where they dance around and play music and ring bells. That's an innovation for me. Or does it mean an innovation, something that nobody in the world has ever thought of before? And I asked the professor who was promoting the name Learning Innovation to give me one example of a recent learning innovation that had never been tried anywhere in the world before. And she said, easy, task-based learning, student-based learning. She said, okay, we can trace it back to Dewey, but student-centered learning is definitely a learning innovation. So I said, have you read Confucius' Analects? If you read the Analects of Confucius, you find Confucius says, Bella works very hard, but she goes too fast. I try to slow her down. Taejin works too slowly. He's very deliberate. He thinks a lot, but his progress is slow. I try to push him to go faster. Okay? And then, I don't tell them everything. I show them just one corner of the square, and they have to find the 3 corners for themselves. That's student-based learning. That's not, what we're doing now is not an innovation in those terms. So we have these reservations, but innovation is such a buzzword, and it's something we're expected to show. Whereas we also have an attachment to things that have been tried and tested over the years. You know, they work. Do we have to get rid of them just because they're old, traditional, or other dirty word that we have? Then there's the question of, well, how do I make my teaching relevant when I have international students, but I also have commitment to my local community? Okay, Education University of Hong Kong. One of the names that was suggested as a joke was the Education University of Taipo. Okay, but the idea was, it wasn't taken seriously. But one of the points was that we have a commitment to the Hong Kong education system. Our major task is training teachers for the education system in Hong Kong. How do we manage that by recruiting more and more international students? That's a tension. Then the use of English against the use of another tongue. That's a tension. Managers against academics. Corporate ideas against public good. That's a tension. Are you a learner or are you a consumer with consumer rights and expectations? Another one comes out is competition or collaboration. In a neoliberal world, competition is good. Competition is how you have winners, how people can become stronger. But at the same time, collaboration is seen as a good thing. So for our grants, for example, we are competing against other people who put in a bid to win a grant. However, the UGC wants to see evidence of collaboration. So how can we compete and collaborate at the same time? That's a tension that we have to resolve. And then I think there really is quite a contradiction between how we do quality assurance. The notion that quality assurance can be formative, helpful, supportive, help people to grow, help people to learn, but we also use it for, okay, contract non-renewal. You're out. Punitive QA that also exists. So that puts, for example, heads of department in a very ambiguous position. On the one hand, they're supposed to nurture their staff, support their staff, but on the other hand, you have the university saying, oh, if your colleagues are not meeting the required standards, then you should say, sorry, we are not going to renew your contract. Well, that puts the HODs into a difficult position. And then we have the issue of university autonomy. We're meant to be autonomous, freedom of academic thought, freedom of academic speech, but increasingly we are regulated by external bodies such as the UGC. Outcomes-based education is an example of this. A few years ago we had a letter from the UGC saying all universities are required to introduce outcomes-based education. You are required to convert all your courses into GILOs, PILOs and GUILOs, or whatever you want to call them, so that they demonstrate the outcomes and coherence and so on. And so we have this tension, well, where's our freedom as an academic when we have to follow all these diktats from governmental sources? So, how can we respond? Well, we found three distinct ways. First one, compliance, go with the flow, whatever, okay, I'm not going to create any trouble, I'm just going to get on with doing it. Or maybe, oh yes, if I comply, I can climb up the system. Defiance is, oh, I don't listen to any of that rubbish, I just do my own thing. Defiance. Appropriation is more subtle, okay? It's go with the flow in my own way. So I do things which on the surface at least seem to comply, but I'm actually doing it in a way that matches my own personal beliefs and ideology. Now I'll give you an example of this. Not many in this room will be familiar with the game of cricket in England. I know Catherine's a very keen cricket fan. But the game of cricket is a very gentle game. It's a gentleman's game originally. It was quite... you have tea in the middle. You stop and have tea, and meant to be based on sportsmanship and very genteel, and we wear smart white clothes, and we are very sporting in how we do it, no cheating. We actually say, it's not cricket in English, means that what you're doing is bad behaviour. Now, Australian missionaries went to the Pacific Islands and found that the inhabitants of these islands lived in a very unsuitable way according to the missionaries' eyes. That their sexual customs were very loose, they were very warlike, they were very aggressive in how they behaved, and they were basically, in terms of the missionaries' views, uncivilized. So how should we civilize them? Teach them cricket. Okay, that will teach them how to learn good manners and be polite and respectful. But what happened was, the Pacific Islanders appropriated cricket. Now in cricket, when you deliver the balls, in baseball you sort of throw it like that, but in cricket you're meant to do a gentle arc like that. The Pacific Islanders turned it into a spear throw. Okay? And instead of just gently hitting the ball, they sort of used to have very aggressive swipes of the ball. And when a player was out, like in baseball if you catch them or you run them out, then in cricket you politely applaud. In the Pacific Islands they did a war dance every time somebody was out. The opposing team did a war dance to celebrate. And instead of tea breaks, they had, it's difficult to describe in polite company, they had this habit of taking a recreation break in the local forest. So each player would choose a maiden, a suitable young lady, and disappear for a while, and come back refreshed and then able to carry on with the game. So what they did was they took this game and they converted it into their own culture, and they made it work in the way that they wanted to. And I think that's a really good example of appropriation. I'm not suggesting we should do that here within the Education University of Hong Kong, but the idea of appropriation is something we could think about. So appropriation. I think what we have to do is to be flexible, first of all. Many universities are either an oil tanker or a speedboat. Okay? An oil tanker is a university that is very difficult to change. You know that it takes about 5 miles for an oil tanker to stop. It takes at least 1 mile for it to begin a turn. They are very slow. Whereas a speedboat is very nippy and adjustable. So if we're going to appropriate, we need to be highly flexible. We need to be more like a speedboat than an oil tanker. We can choose how we see students. Either we see them as consumers, or learners, or both. They're actually not mutually exclusive. Okay? So we don't have to reject one or the other. We can find ways in which we are able to manage both. The other thing that's happened in many places is that mission drift occurs. Now if you take our university, for example, teacher education has always been our mission. But because of the forces of marketing, we needed to become a university. University title was mainly for marketing purposes. When we did that, we had to change. We had to have 3 faculties instead of 1 faculty. We had to have faculties which were non-education, which is the idea of education plus, so the faculty of humanities and the faculty of liberal arts and social sciences were developed because they were close to education, but they were non-education. So what we did was actually drift away from our mission. There was a period of time when the Faculty of Education was getting less funding because it was being diverted to the other faculties to build them up. Yet that was our core mission, to be an education university. So one of the things that happens with appropriation is actually a kind of mission driven. Now, some of the things which I would like to sort of see happening and which have been addressed in some countries is the issue of QA, and I'll talk more about this later. There's been some work in the USA done to really question what do we mean by quality assurance, what is quality, how can quality assurance mechanisms actually work in a way that does focus on what we all agree is the meaning of quality. And we've looked at how, in our research, we found different strategies used by individuals to maintain their autonomy, how various universities kept their soft sciences, because hard sciences seem to be benefiting the most from neoliberalism. Hard sciences, big ticket research, outcomes, measurable, and so on. And in doing so, we need to value the qualitative and the unmeasurable. I'm going to have a look at this. Our overall results was that neoliberalism has got certain trends which you find in nearly every country. Internationalisation, the rise of English as the medium of instruction, curriculum change, IT, blah, blah, blah. Those we tended to find quite commonly in most countries. However, what we did find was that different systems, different countries, different education systems, different universities, and different individuals interpreted them in very different ways. So that there was a considerable variety of how neoliberal trends were actually being interpreted. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Okay? So, for example, in Central Asia, regional partnerships were funded by the Aga Khan in a way that focused mainly on the culture of the Central Asian region. So they took the pressure to amalgamate and form regional partnerships, but in a way that advanced the social agenda of the Aga Khan. So it was a religious and cultural agenda that used the vehicle of regionalisation as a way of achieving their particular goals. So that was one of our studies. In China, higher education is a means of achieving soft power, what we call the pandarization of China. China is no longer a dragon, it's a panda, and that's done through soft power. And the use of international students actually was part of the strategy to gain access to Africa, to build relationships with African countries. So we have the major China-Africa project that Kenneth King has written about as one of the ways in which they have used international students for their own domestic purposes of achieving economic and political alliances with African countries. And now increasingly One Belt, One Road, Central Asia as well. Hong Kong, well, we understood internationalisation as mainlandisation. That was the most comfortable way how we could compete, mainly because of the language issues, because of Chinese. We could really access and encourage mainlandisation, and we could say, oh, this is internationalisation, even though now we have to call them non-local students. We can't call them international, because that's politically incorrect. And likewise, setting ourselves up as a regional hub, so that we could attract and become a market centre, if you like. And that's failed, I think, quite spectacularly. But it's there, part of the notion. Small states, they saw a way of strengthening themselves by forming regional partnerships. Sometimes it worked well, sometimes it wasn't flexible enough. Too many oil tankers trying to work together. That tended to fail a little bit. But some good examples of partnerships and regional alliances. So, this is the main point of what I want to talk about. I want to talk about three areas where I think within this university we have opportunities for appropriation. And I want to explain my thoughts on how we can do it. The first one is language policy. Tae has been leading work and I've been assisting her with it. How do we do EMI or any other international language? How do we do it effectively? Now, I remember at a meeting quite early on when a very senior colleague said, EMI, no problem, you just take your PowerPoints and you translate them into English. No, that's not how you do EMI. If we are going to do anything that's related to language change, then we need to have a theory of language underpinning what we do. In other words, we have to understand how language works, how second and third languages are learned, and we have to apply that theory in how we introduce change here. So it's not just a question of translating your handouts and your PowerPoints into English. You have to realise, first of all, that language learning is slow and complex. It's not easy to learn a language. Most of you here are operating a second language now in this room, or even a third language, and you know from your own experiences, learning languages is difficult and it's slow. The only way you can learn new language is if the new language is comprehensible in terms not only of the language itself, but also the content of the language. Now, sometimes I watch the Chinese news and I have no idea what they're saying because I don't understand the news story and I don't understand the language. It's so unfamiliar, it's beyond my learning ability. The only way I can learn a new story is if the language is familiar to me. Then I can learn the content because I can understand the language. The only way I can understand new language is if the content is familiar to me. Or if they are both just a small amount of new language and new content. It's got to be very close to me in order for me to develop my language. The other thing we need to know is that receptive skills, listening and reading, develop much faster than speaking and writing. We cannot criticise our students' writing ability without realising that there is a lag in time between their ability to read, for example, a journal article, and their ability to write an academic paper. There is a whole linguistic processing time lag between those two things. Also, I heard recently another senior academic saying, the schools are letting us down. They are not training the students properly for university study. Well, I'm sorry, it's not the job of schools to train the students to do this. It's our job because we are introducing new ideas, new jargon, and new ways of expressing those ideas. New genre, new ways of writing. We don't expect secondary school children to write academic papers. We don't expect them to read a scholarly book. We don't expect that. That is the job of universities. So universities have got to accept that they are language teachers. And language needs scaffolding that needs to be supported. You don't just expect some kind of miraculous process of osmosis that people will learn a language. There has to be scaffolded. And our research is showing more and more that multilingual approaches are better than monolingual approaches. You often hear English only, no Chinese. Well, no, that actually is a wrong theoretical construct. Please use Chinese or Korean or German or whatever language you like in order to enhance your English. Use it as part of the scaffolding process. Okay, use it judiciously and with a clear purpose, but other languages give you a database that can help you to improve your English. Okay, so those kind of things underpin the handbook that Tae and I wrote. what you've got to do is to reduce your curriculum to the core content, the essential learning. You have to integrate language standards into assessment. You have to think of the zone of proximal development, the Zweijin-Fajian-Chu, of Vygotsky. We have a learnability zone. We have to keep things within our capacity to learn. Multilingual classes. And there is nobody in this room apart from Catherine who can write perfect English. Catherine's a professional writer. Your English is perfect. My English is not that standard. We do not use Catherine as the benchmark for measuring everybody else in this room, including me. Okay? The point is this. We should not have high expectations that are impossible for students to reach. You know from the Gaokao. Okay? Stress is too great. So we should just expect the quality of English that is reasonable for an undergraduate or a doctoral student to acquire. That should be our benchmark, not perfect English. Alright, the second thing I want to talk about is quality assurance, which I think the way we do quality assurance is totally lacking in quality. Because we haven't thought about what's the theory and rationale behind our quality assurance mechanisms. And quality assurance is surely a research project. We are carrying out an evaluative research project when we conduct quality assurance. So if we are carrying out an evaluative research project, then we must make sure that what we do meets the standards that we would expect of any undergraduate or postgraduate research project. And I think the way we do QA would fail an undergraduate research project in many ways. So the questions we need to ask, are we doing things which are ethical when we do QA? Are they valid? Are they reliable? And I think in many cases the answer is no. Do we have clear research questions from the outset? Again, I think the answer is no. Very often we undertake quality assurance with no clear ideas in our mind as to what we are actually assuring and how we're going to do it. And the goalposts seem to change all the time. Different stakeholders have different conceptions of what they are looking for. And we have a research question. Well, is our data collection and data analysis consistent with those questions? Do we have the golden thread, the Itiaolu, which makes this a coherent research undertaking? Do we only rely on quantitative data, or do we allow qualitative data? And are these quantitative and qualitative data of sufficient rigour? Have we got measures in place that avoid bias and over-subjectivity? Okay. And do we have a decent sample size for a statistical analysis? Again, I think the answer to many of these questions is no. I mean, I never tire of telling people that last year I was the best teacher in the university. My set scores were very, very high, according to the quantitative analysis of the 3 students I taught last year. And I was telling one of my colleagues, and I said, look, how well I do with just 3 students. I get very high marks. You've got 400 students and your statistical analysis is much lower. That shows I'm a really good teacher. And he says, that shows you know nothing about statistics. But it is true that we allow statistical analysis of a non-viable sample size to influence major decisions that are made about promotion, contract renewal, and other kinds of performance outcomes. So these are questions that we are failing to really acknowledge when we look at our quality assurance. So any good quality assurance process must be a yes to all of these. Okay? Now the third area is research assessment. Again, what what is the theory that should underpin research assessment? Well, we do all kinds of things, and I think it's recognised that research assessment, formal research assessment, has not been done satisfactorily so far. Because in Britain they keep on changing it. They keep on adding things, changing things, dropping elements, bringing in new ideas such as knowledge transfer and impact studies and so on. All of which indicate there is something wrong with how we do research assessment. And again, if we're doing research assessment, the key is in the word assessment. So what is our theory of assessment and the principles, and are they underpinning what we do? So, assessment, we talk about assessment of learning and assessment for learning, and the trend has been with student-centeredness that assessment should be for learning. But there are times when we do need assessment of learning, because we need to give people certificates and we need to appraise their performance. But I would think that the most powerful form of assessment is formative assessment, and that should be the major focus of any research assessment exercise. Yes, we can keep the summative because there are purposes for which a degree of summative information is necessary. The next thing about assessment is, when we are assessing a course assignment, it has to be realistic. It has to be something students can actually do. So, are our expectations of research actually manageable? Are they doable? Otherwise, everybody will fail the assessment and the assessment should be declared invalid. So, does it have a sufficient range to encompass all the levels of researchability that a university should include? Here's another thing we fail drastically on. Nobody knows what the assessment criteria are. Here, and I don't want to criticise my own university because I think it's the same everywhere, our criteria tend to be very vague. Outstanding, good, satisfactory, unsatisfactory. Well, what do these actually mean? Now, somebody say, well, good is basically one international journal article a year. Okay, fine, but that's not very helpful. It's a little proxy indicator, but what do we actually mean by outstanding? And in my impression, satisfactory now actually means unsatisfactory. If you get satisfactory, it means you're doing what you are paid to do. You're performing satisfactorily, you're meeting the terms of your contract. But if you get satisfactory, all kinds of bells go off. And your line manager has to sit down with you and say, you're only satisfactory, you're going to have to improve. Well, if I'm doing what I'm paid to do, isn't satisfactory already sufficient? Why should I do more than I'm paid to do? So those kind of issues need more talking about. We need more moderation. Not too many people being involved, but we need good quality moderation to ensure that there is a degree of maintenance of quality. And I don't mean necessarily one poor person having to sit on 30 research assessment panels. I think what we need to do is to work so that we all have a shared understanding as to what is an A-class journal article and a B-class journal article and a C-class journal article. We need to have those kind of discussions and those kind of training so we can build consensus. Any assessment has to have face validity and reliability, otherwise it's not a good assessment. And the other thing we have to avoid with assessment is the washback. We should not let research assessment drive our policies. We should be aiming for quality anyway. And the formative nature of assessment should help us to achieve what we consider to be quality. But we shouldn't allow an assessment exercise to totally dominate how we think about our research. It should not be a question if, for example, Galfan, you come up with a research idea, a research project, an idea, and I say, nah, this won't get you into the research assessment exercise. I think that's narrowing down, it's letting the tail wag the dog rather than the other way around. So we have to make sure that we don't allow too much washback from formal research assessment exercises to dominate our thinking. Okay? So, to sum up, I think we can take all these new things, quality assurance, research assessment, English as a medium instruction, and we can take them, okay, we accept them as a fact of life, but we have to think how we can improve on them, find our own integrity within them, align them with theories of education. That's what theories are there for. Okay? Language policy should be based on language learning theory. Quality assurance, quality enhancement should be a research exercise, fit for purpose. And RAE should be like any good assessment exercise. It should be based on assessment theory and principles. We should see ourselves as a learning organisation, a formative organisation. We value bottom-up initiatives, form communities of practice. We need to keep our cultural characteristics. The Education University of Taipo has got specific characteristics that we need to keep. Okay? In China they talk about 中继西用, which is maintaining Chineseness as you import Western technology. Same with the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Keep Japaneseness while borrowing from scientific and technological ideas from elsewhere. Okay? We also need to keep some of us keep our Westernness, but borrowing Chinese ideas. It's not all about one-way Westernization. There should be a degree here of Chinesization, but maintaining our own cultural identity as well. And if we are a learning organisation, that means sustainability is important. Capacity building. Short-term contracts don't help sustainability, they don't help capacity building. Okay? We have to think about viability of individuals, institutions and systems according to their zone of proximal development, which is that. Okay. So here is where we are now. This is our savoir-faire, this is our ability to do higher education. We have an ability to improve and to learn, but we shouldn't go beyond that. We should be realistic in setting ourselves the targets to learn and learn and learn, keeping our integrity, keeping our viability, keeping our sustainability. Thank you. Thoughts?
Sounds as if you should be in April.
I just wondered, like, what kind of data you collected?
What kind of data we collected? Well, it depended on the country. What we did was we actually contacted research organisations who had been doing work in the field. So, for example, in Australia, we worked with 2 researchers that had been looking at individual use of space, how individuals actually created their own in space for integrity. So they've done a lot of individual interview work. Okay? Somebody in America had done work on formal systems of quality assurance, and she looked at documentation and interviews with stakeholders. And her view was that most universities think if you keep on saying the word quality often enough, then it magically comes into reality. So hers was mainly documentary based. So it depended on the focus. The Indian one was looking at institutional change at the systemic level, how systems cope with change.
But then if the data collected at different costs or contexts, how can we claim, because like my understanding, like the impression I got from the presentation is that you had to like compare all these different aspects. Is it like, can we really say it was rigorous, like for instance when you're trying to publish, would it be problematic?
We weren't trying so much to compare every single element. What we were comparing was the nature of neoliberal discourse and how